Good morning, everyone. I'm suffering from rather a double whammy this morning. First of all, I had an introduction to a traditional Irish pub last night. Secondly, reading the Irish Independent at breakfast, I discovered that with almost immediate effect, I've got to pay at least 20,000 euros extra tax as a result of our Chancellor's budget yesterday. The combination of these two matters was quite enough to put me off entirely the full Irish breakfast, which was the great thing which I had negotiated with the hotel over the last week to be thrown in free. But there we are. Now, initially, the title of my paper lacked the words surface transport, but I've insisted that my paper be confined to surface transport, partly because of the limitations of time, and partly because that's the area in which I specialize, and therefore the only area I can properly talk to you about with any measure of authority. I go straight to our Archbishop, and I think probably everyone here in this room is going to be content with the first, second, and fourth sentences there. The third sentence may be a little bit more controversial, but may not matter. But it did seem to me that the point, and it really is the point why we're all gathered together here, is very well expressed in that particular quotation. But I've got to come down to the humdrum of policy matters, and tackling climate change as a key government priority for the planning system, that is now built into our planning guidance as something absolutely fundamental. And we have, in the last year, passed two important pieces of legislation, and their contents you will find summarized in paragraph 2 of my paper. The Planning Act 2008 now requires that development plans include policies to secure that the development and use of land contributes to the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. And we've got a Climate Change Act, of which the UK government is very proud, in that I think we're the only country who has got legally binding targets. Of course, it's a bit like an EU directive in that who knows what happens if the legally binding target isn't in fact met by the government. But certainly in our legislative programme, we are in the UK taking climate change very seriously. And from our white paper on transport, I set out the quotation there, and it seems to me that the really key matter is that passage encouraging behavioural change. Now that may be a little bit familiar to those of you who study your own country's policies, because in the Smarter Travel document there, we see there that delivering a sustainable transport system is an important dimension of the climate change agenda, and your own national climate change strategy again emphasizes the huge importance of transport in all of this. And there is the usual invocations of the role of public transport. Now in the UK, it is fiscal tools which have been at the forefront of the battle to try to improve the position and control the question of carbon emissions. We were well ahead of Ireland in relation to introducing CO2 differentials for our vehicle excise duty. I am aware that you are now catching up and you are just beginning to introduce a CO2 differential. we're going on now from 7 to 13 bands for different differentials, and that will have a considerable effect on the license which you pay each year for your car, and the differential will be from paying nothing if you are a non-emitter up to about £1,000 if you are a high emitter. Whether in the scale of things that's enough to make a real difference must be questionable, in that if you have one of these large cars, you probably spend €750 or something every time you have the car serviced in any event. So whether it actually makes that amount of difference, a bit uncertain. Fuel duty, for a long time we've been committed to increasing fuel duty in line with inflation, but then we've dragged behind that and it hasn't worked. My paper is wrong because it's been overtaken by the budget yesterday, and we are going to go ahead from next year to having fuel increases at 1% above the rate of inflation. And that seems to me to be a satisfactory and sensible way to proceed. Like Ireland, we exempt electric vehicles from road tax licensing, and I get to come back to the question of electric vehicles a little bit later. They've been absolutely at the top of the English newspapers for the last couple of weeks, and it was announced last week that from 2010, when you purchase an electrically powered vehicle, you are going to get a subsidy from the state of between £2,000 to £5,000. This, of course, is an attempt to make electric cars purchasable in the sense of reducing their particular costs. So far as tax reliefs on business cars, we've got quite an advanced scheme, and we've got a rather important scheme of tax exemptions for cyclists. Now, I suspect here in Ireland you'll all rather laugh about this cyclist. I have so far seen one cyclist in the city of Cork, who I saw this morning. Yesterday, I drove through Cork and I saw not a single cyclist, and I did see one bicycle shop, and it was closed. It had been vacated. And so I guess you've got a pretty long way to go on the cycling front, so it's something I feel pretty passionately about. I was in Amsterdam 2 weeks ago. But we have got this remarkable cycle to work scheme, which you'll find I deal with in paragraph 8 of my paper, and I think we are in England beginning to get the message that we've got to get around in a different way. There are no particular, I think, EC treaty problems in relation to the use of these fiscal tools. Article 90 seems to have been interpreted so as to allow it, and I draw attention to a particular case dealing with that. At the end of the day, though, are we doing enough? I mean, as George Monbiot says, no expense is spared saving the bank, every expense is spared saving the biosphere. Now, that may be a rather jaundiced view, because I think we are beginning to do something, but it is amazing when one thinks of the money which is now being pumped into the banks and other things, and how little into the other areas. I come on to two particular planning examples, which may be of some relevance. For many years, there's been a plan to construct a new bridge across the River Thames in East London. And what was devised with government backing was quite a remarkable bridge, which had got 2 lanes reserved for public transport, and the whole bridge was sufficiently strengthened that it could be upgraded to carry trams if trams ever became viable. But inevitably, when you create a new crossing, you will increase the traffic over it. Quite a long way into the inquiry, Friends of the Earth introduced the question of CO2 emissions into the inquiry in 2005, And what was significant was that the inspectors who were reporting on the matter, and they reported against constructing the bridge, but a particular feature they drew attention to was that that bridge would result in a negative contribution to the government's commitments to reducing greenhouse gases, and even small increases were of no assistance whatever. And so a policy reason, and that is going to make it very difficult for those in England promoting new road schemes in the future, if it is accepted that if there is an increase in traffic as a result, it's to be treated as contrary to policy and refused. The second is a very much more recent decision at the very end of March of this year, permitting phase 2 of a tram scheme in Nottingham, in which I was involved. And there, although the total saving in CO2 emissions was relatively small when you took account of the electricity which had to be generated in order to run the tram in the first place, leaving to you at the end only 1,000 tonnes per annum, but that was held to be a worthwhile environmental benefit to be set against a number of disbenefits of the particular scheme. I turn then to the question of road user charging. Now, I found your document, Smarter Travel, a fascinating read. On public consultation, I see that road pricing was generally acceptable to those who were consulted. I guess probably it was a rather small group who responded to the consultation. They were treated as equitable. Then rather fudged in the report, saying, well, you know, perhaps for tomorrow. And it's interesting that the next speaker today quotes some academic research saying that road user charging is now inevitable in Ireland. I wait agog to see it, and I see that you've got a new provisions for a parking levy in urban areas, and I'll be interested to see what happens there, because I think we are considerably ahead of you there. First of all for London, and then generally for the country as a whole, in 1999 and 2000, we introduced specific legislation to allow area-based road user charging. That's where whole segments of cities can be subject, in effect, to a tax to drive, a charge to go into it. Not limited to a single road. I mean, the concept of a toll road, I know you have, and you've the legislation for, but it was decided you needed specific legislation to introduce area-based charging. And we then followed that up with the Central London Congestion Charging Scheme, whereby you now pay £8 a day if you want to bring your car in. It's then been extended to lorries over the entirety of Greater London with the London Low Emission Zone. So unless you have got a lorry which satisfies quite demanding standards, you pay a very large charge indeed to enter that area. Only one other town has got a congestion charging scheme. Little Durham, with its magnificent cathedral and its very strong university, has a one-street congestion charging scheme. But had I been giving this paper last year here, I'd have said that one could be pretty optimistic. Congestion charging was on the roll. But starting in Edinburgh, they had a referendum and rejected the idea of congestion charging. Greater Manchester, a vast conurbation, was offered by the government a very good package that they could have enough money to fund 3 extensions to their tram system, provided they introduced a congestion charging scheme. Well, they put it to a referendum and they lost in every single local authority in the area, and that has been scrapped. Cambridge, busy university city, as well as being a high-tech centre, severe problems. They, July last year, abandoned their proposed scheme on the grounds that it hadn't got public acceptability. Workplace parking, rather like the Irish scheme, only Nottingham has been brave enough to take on their Chamber of Commerce and to make a scheme, but it has to be confirmed by the Secretary of State, and frankly the Secretary of State is been sitting on it and keeps saying there'll be an announcement next month as to whether to allow a scheme whereby there is charging for every workplace parking space that is provided. Meanwhile, our new Mayor of London, who we may have come across, the inimitable Boris Johnson, who rather splendidly recently said, "My policy on cake is both to have it and to eat it." He has set about the machinery to remove part of the Central London scheme, to remove it from the large area of Kensington and Chelsea, what I may call the posh area, to take it away from there. And whereas the low emissions zone was to be rolled out to vans and light commercial vehicles next year, he said they're not going to go ahead on that. And the government is seriously considering whether to make a direction to the Mayor of London, saying that unless he introduces these, we're not going to meet our EU air pollution targets. So there's a little battle about to come there. And Ken Livingstone was about to introduce emissions-related congestion charging, whereby the big cars, the big pollutants, would pay £25 a day, but that has been abandoned. Well, of course, human rights issues do arise, and you'll find that set out in my paper. And very interestingly, in the early part of last year, the German motor manufacturer Porsche launched a judicial review challenge to the then Mayor of London about the introduction of emissions-related congestion charging. And in particular, they relied upon a number of Porsche dealers and Porsche repair manufacturers who were going to be put out of business, and they said that that was going to be an interference with their Article 1 rights. Who knows how that would have gone? They also raised a fascinating point based on freedom of movement, and you find this analysed in my paper. I haven't really time to deal with it, but it would have led to the need for a close examination of those two cases, Commission on Austria and Commission on Italy. Those of you who enjoy these sort of cases, do read Commission on Italy, ban on trailer towing mopeds. Apparently in Italy, farmers all tow a little trailer behind their moped. That was then banned by the government as being thoroughly unsafe. Rather amazingly, the Commission saw fit to bring proceedings saying that it was an interference with freedom of movement, and in particular it was going to put out of business certain foreign firms who manufactured the trailers. Well, eventually the ECJ threw out that challenge and said that although it was a breach of freedom of movement, it was something which was proportionate and acceptable and therefore could be allowed. But these are issues which have arisen in England on congestion charging, and which will, I feel pretty confident, arise again. And if you do try and introduce it over here, anyone concerned would need to study their Article 28, which otherwise they might have forgotten in the context. Parking charges may seem a rather dull subject, but in England a number of authorities have now introduced CO2-related parking charges, whereby you pay more for a high-polluting vehicle. And the London Borough of Richmond has taken the lead, and they are about to extend the use of CO2 differentials to all on and off-street parking. The result is there'll be a threefold tariff, and if you've got a low-polluting car, you will pay very substantially less to park on the street or in a local authority car park than if you've got a high-polluting car. highly controversial, not liked by local people. Many people saying, isn't this a thing for national government rather than local government? Does it really make sense that in one part of London you've got a different scheme for parking, but Richmond, who are led by Liberal Democrats, our greenest party, they say that it's a necessary step. Well, then we come to electric cars, and in my paper I've set out some of the, at paragraph 22 on page 13, some of the new vehicles which are now coming on stream. There are two big challenges. First of all, to have cars which have got a long-range battery, something which will really get you somewhere, but that is now being solved. And most remarkably, the BMW Mini E, which is a sort of Mini Cooper. I don't think you have terribly many Mini Coopers over here, but it's really rather a nice car, the Mini Cooper. You simply take out the back seat and have a very large battery, and doing that, rather remarkably, you can drive for a range of 150 miles with a top speed of 95 mph. Now, this is something which I think really has got real potential. I mean, personally, I'd prefer the Tesla, which does even better, but that does have a starting price of £87,000 sterling, and therefore is probably beyond the range of probably all of us here today. But this Mini, I think, probably is the way forward. And we have got in England, vying against themselves, the government and Boris Johnson as to who can be more enthusiastic about electric cars at present. You see there Gordon Brown, UK to be the world leader in the production of electric and hybrid cars. Boris Johnson, same day, London to become the electric vehicle capital of Europe. And a big scheme for car leasing and so forth to be run. Bicycles, I don't know whether any of you have been to Paris and seen their Vélib scheme, whereby you simply pick up a bicycle and you pay for it on your credit card. London in the spring of next year is going to introduce a bicycle scheme, and Boris Johnson has this idea that cyclists should be permitted to turn left at traffic lights. So even when the traffic light's on red, they're allowed to turn left, provided they look out for pedestrians. So we'll see what happens there. It requires a change to the regulations, as I point out. Well, I've been told I got one more minute. Our Secretary of State says people matter. The things they do and the choices they make add up. In Ireland, your Taoiseach seems to be saying exactly the same thing, that you've got to change your behaviour. Now, the wackiest scheme of all is the one I put at the end of my paper for California, which is solar roadways, where you've got this great expanse of all our highways, you fit them out like a solar panel, and in this way think of the scope for creating energy from the sun at what's said to be a very small cost. Now, the problem for Ireland, as I put in my paper, is one does slightly question whether it can work. And then finally, an afterthought, it seems actually that if we gave up spam emails, we would actually probably do as much for cutting emissions as, indeed, we get rid of the equivalent of 3.1 million cars if only we could get rid of that particular problem. So the answer is there are lots of things and ideas about, and I shall be interested to see how far we progress in the United Kingdom and to what extent in Ireland you too follow suit. Thank you very much.